Hello, I'm Sue. Welcome to Fireside Chat. I wanted to do some fun reading tonight. I thought this is a book that I'm borrowing from the station. It's called UFO Hostilities and the Evil Alien Agenda. This is lethal encounters with ultra-terrestrials exposed, and it's by Timothy Green Beckley and Sean Castile with others. So I thought I would just open the page and just read because you know what? Why not? So I have a skull here to kind of set the mood. And so I don't know if you can see it where it's just sitting perched over here, but it just kind of gets me in the mood for like Halloween and everything. So this is called They Never Came Back. Actress Carol Lombard's death due to UFOs. So I can't tell you for sure if this is true or not, but I just think it would be entertaining. Publisher's note. To this day, a cloak of mystery surrounds the death of actress Carol Lombard and includes the specter of synchronicity and a possible UFO connection. I was tipped off to these astounding historical events that fit right into our presentation by script writer and Edgar Allan Poe aficionado Cynthia Surreal. It's not that the whole plane she was traveling in vanished, but she certainly never came back. According to researcher Kyle J. Wood, officially, Ms. Lombard's doomed flight was running late and the pilot was cruising at too low an altitude, resulting in the death of all 21 passengers, says the on-air contributing guest to E! Entertainment's Mysteries and Scandals show. Quote, unofficially, some still believe it to have been the work of fate via supernatural design. In short, the number 3, a reputed bad luck numeral at the time, seemed to be everywhere. The Lombard party was supposed to travel back to Los Angeles via train after the War Bond Party rally in Indianapolis. Their group of 3, consisting of Carol, her mother Elizabeth, and friend Otto Winkler, that's a crazy name, only managed to board the plane because of 3 last-minute seat cancellations. Carol was 33 years old at the time. It had taken 3 days to reach Indiana, her home state, by train. The plane was a DC-3, designated Flight 3. So I don't know what is up with all these 3s. An FBI document filed at the time and released under the Freedom of Information Act tells of mysterious lights seen over a nearby mountain range, which some say may have contributed to the plane's crash in some form or another, perhaps drawing undue attention by the pilot. Journalist Kyle J. Wood summarizes, quote, much has been forgotten about the peculiar lights in the sky that were noted in regards to the crash of Lombard's flight. Hanging like a suspended lantern above the mountain range, the mysterious unexplained light was first theorized to have possibly been part of a sabotage plot to lure Flight 3 to its doom because of the 15 Army Air Corps ferry pilots on board. This theory was quickly discounted after an airway beacon mechanic came forward and reported to the FBI about seeing an identical type light hovering in the sky above Baker, California, just 3 days earlier. The mechanic was engaged in recovery efforts following the Lombard crash when he by chance learned of the similar light from an area ranch owner who had seen both the light and the plane's fiery explosion. The case has also been tied in with the Battle of Los Angeles UFO sightings, which occurred around the same time. Writing in true Hollywood gossip style, scandalmonger Robert Mattson seems to concur with our UFO-driven speculation about the late actress. Quote, as I mentioned to a reporter in Fort Wayne, I have now finally accessed the FBI files on the plane crash, and I kid you not, UFOs were seen in the Flight 3 airway on nights leading up to January 16. No, seriously, UFOs. Many people logically dismiss UFOs as Cold War paranoia, but we're talking sightings of odd lights in the sky before the era of Roswell and the flying saucer by eyewitnesses that included Civil Aeronautics Authority man, a Fed, a trained observer, equivalent to today's FAA investigators, who saw spherical lights in the sky that were not aircraft. For the record, I don't believe that UFOs had anything to do with the crash of TWA Flight 3. I am remarking on how bizarre it is to find UFOs in the official FBI investigation. Then there's the other incident that I'm still working on that's no less odd. Neither solves the mystery of Flight 3. On the contrary, both make answers all the more elusive and demonstrate how sometimes evidence and logic go right out the window. And suddenly, you're in that other dimension where people are dead and nobody can figure out how they got that way. The FBI top secret file, dated February 2, 1942, has been summarized best by Jack Elhai, author of The Nazi and the Psychiatrist from 2013, Nonstop from 2013, and The Lobotomist 2005. We cover the part only about the unidentified specters in the sky that might have pulled the actress and other unfortunate souls to their demise. The FBI file tells how agents did follow up on another lead. UFOs, reported by several eyewitnesses, may have played a role in the crash. One of those witnesses, name redacted, a CAA employee, explained in a letter dated February 23, 1942, that he saw a strange light on the night of January 12 or 13. Quote, at about 7 p.m. that evening, he and another employee were driving a CAA truck towards Baker, California on the Death Valley Highway. Quote, I glanced to the west, and we both noted a light above the crest line of the mountains, which was about 15 miles distant, he wrote. This light was a bright white light similar to an 18-inch course light, stationary and suspended against the sky as a background, and never moved or varied as long as we could see. It looked round, more like a ball. I am satisfied it was not a star because we drove back to the station approximately an hour later, and the light was gone. In addition, the light was much larger and brighter than any star. We dismissed it from our minds because we could give no reasonable explanation for it. End quote. The letter goes on to explain that a few days later, while helping in the search for the plane wreck, the CAA employee recalled the sighting when he met a local rancher named Willard H. George, who described a similar light he saw just a few minutes before the crash. The file contains a copy of a long letter George wrote to a CAA panel that was investigating the cause of the accident. George, a native of Las Vegas, had owned a cattle ranch in the nearby hills for 15 years. Quote, I have ridden this territory on horseback both when I was a boy and in later years, and know the territory in which this plane fell probably as well as anyone in that country, end quote, he wrote. On the evening of January 16, the letter explains, George and his wife were driving home from the El Rancho Hotel in Las Vegas. About 6 miles west of the city, they saw above a mountain ridge a reddish-yellow glowing light which seemed suspended in the air. The Georges continued to see the light as they drove west. We first thought it was a big bonfire in the mountains, but looking more closely at it, saw that there was no flicker to it. cold cases. It's an undisputed fact that every year, hundreds, actually thousands of people vanish into thin air, some right smack dab in front of friends and family. Some turn up again, oftentimes with a strange story to tell or with a lack of memory that prevents them from discussing where they were or what they were doing during the period that they were missing. Others are out there somewhere in limbo, never to be heard from again. Historian Charles Fort kept tabs on the missing, but we're not just talking about cases where some poor soul was murdered and the body hidden in a shallow grave or cemented somewhere down in a dark corner of your neighbor's basement. No, we're talking about the guy next door who went to buy a pack of smokes and his family never sees him again. There was the famous case of the very dapper Judge Crater, who became the missingest man in New York City when on August 6, 1930, he vanished into thin air amongst the four corners of the world, Times Square. He was on his way to have dinner with a lawyer friend and a sassy showgirl and then attend the play Dancing Partner, for which he had scored tickets. For some reason, his evening adventures ended prematurely as he sauntered by other Manhattanites on their way home from work, never to be seen or heard from again. A massive manhunt was undertaken, but to no avail. It was speculated that he had split from his wife, packed his bags, and headed to Mexico with some young chickadee. There were reported sightings of the judge over the years, but none of these sightings panned out, and finally he was declared dead 10 years later after every means to find him had been exhausted. Some say he was abducted by the mob and laid to rest under the Coney Island boardwalk, but even though the boardwalk was dug up at the designated spot, no bones or remains were ever found. The judge had been vanquished to the Neverland of the missing. Thank you very much. Fort also wrote about Ambrose Small, another dapper gentleman, complete with well-coiffed mustache and known as the toast of the Toronto Theatre District. Small owned a chain of successful theaters, but he was a notorious gambler and was always looking for ways to get out from behind his debts. One day in 1919, he concluded a business deal which netted him $1 million, and he was last seen in public in joyful, frolicking mood at the local opera house. It was a bitter, cold, snowy night, and eventually Ambrose knew he had to duck out and head for home. It was his usual custom to stop at a newsstand on the nearby corner of Adelaide and Yonge, my hometown, and pick up the late edition coming in by train. But this evening, the proprietor informed the theatrical promoter that due to the inclement weather, the paper had not arrived as the locomotive had gotten southbound, south of town. Mr. Small was fit to be tied that his usual habit of picking up the paper had been disrupted, and he started fuming and cursing, a state he was never known to have been in before. Eventually, he gave up the ghost and became one. It took several days before anyone realized Ambrose had gone with the wind. But when the authorities discovered that he was missing, they put the full force of the city into looking for him. Nothing. They looked high and low and found no trace of Small. He had stepped into the snowy night and seemingly melted away, despite an offered reward of $50,000 for information as to his whereabouts. Catchpenny sleuths were called in, and psychics were consulted. No stone went unturned. There were a number of sightings of the entrepreneur, but they were challenged and proven unreliable. Sherlock Holmes' creator and psychical researcher Sir Arthur Conan Doyle expressed interest in this case and said he was willing to lend a hand in the search, but was never officially approached by the police or the family. So eventually, Doyle returned to England, leaving everyone involved no wiser in the case. A death certificate was eventually issued, and where am I here? And the episode was officially closed. Poor Small was reduced to nothing. poor theatrical community which experienced a reduction in ticket sales as their chief impresario was no more. Breaking news. Today, you can hardly spend an evening in front of your smart TV without being offered up a variety of programs that deal with those who have gone missing. There's Dateline, 2020 on the networks, Vanished, Gone, Disappeared on cable's ID channel, and a host of other one-shots and solo season programs that dot Showtime, HBO, Netflix, and Amazon Prime. My favorite show that delves into those that have gone astray for one reason or another would be Crime Watch, which is a daily syndicated program which you kind of have to hunt for, but which is worth the search. Nancy Grace used to devote a lot of time to those whose lives were shortened by being abducted or running off into the night ether, either on their own or at the hands of some masked avenger. But then her production dropped this popular, to me, aspect of the program. In lieu of repeat performances of the Mendez brothers and Lacey Peterson crimes. Boring. Let's help the disadvantaged and those who are seeking their loved ones' whereabouts, not glorify those who the handman should have found a long time ago. Most of the cases investigated on these shows turn out to be homicides that are eventually solved. But once in a while, you will hear some rural sheriff or constable make a statement like, quote, "It's as if they were picked up by a spaceship," unquote, when trying to account for the sudden and at least temporary disappearance of an individuals, or in some cases, an entire family. People are not supposed to just disappear. It was June 7, 1992, and the above is a direct quote attributed to local authorities in Springfield, Missouri, who after all this time have no explanation as to what might have happened to three women who disappeared out of a quiet suburban home, leaving behind cash, credit cards, keys, and leaving nothing out of place. Nor were there any indications of forced entry, a struggle, or any form of violence in the case. Cheryl Levitt, her daughter Susie Streeter, and friend Stacy McCall have never been seen since. The two young women were friends who had graduated from Kickapoo High School the day before and had apparently gotten ready for bed when the unexpected took place, whatever the unexpected might have been. The media in and around Springfield, such as the Kansas City Star, still brings up the disappearance from time to time, as it still weighs heavy on the minds of local residents who kept their doors locked day in and day out, day and night for a long time afterward. It was June 7, 1992, when the three women vanished. The three haven't been heard from since that day, when friends showed up at Levitt's home on East Delmar Street and found a broken porch light. Little else seemed out of place. All three of the women's cars were parked out front. Their purses and keys were inside the small white home. A smoker, Cheryl, 47, had left her cigarettes behind, and Stacy, 18, who battled migraines, hadn't taken along her medication. A lack of evidence or any real sign of foul play has frustrated a long line of detectives who have taken their turn at trying to solve the mystery. How do you wrap your head around three people literally disappearing with no idea where they went? Said Sergeant Todd King, who started at the police department in 1994 and remembers as a rookie taking reports from people who had information they thought would be helpful. In a lot of cold cases, you can look back and say this is probably what occurred. You just can't prove it. With this case, it's anything goes. Anything could have happened. You don't have anything that says they were abducted, they were harmed. It's this big mystery. Three who did return. I like this account in particular as it tells of an event involving three women who disappeared and were not seen anymore. It's strikingly similar to an incident that took place in Liberty, Kentucky, where three women literally went up into the night but did return to their homes to tell the tale. I spoke with one of the ladies at the time, and I had no reason to doubt her story, which was vivid and lucid. January 6th was Mona Stafford's 36th birthday. She was joined by her best friends Louise Smith and Elaine Thomas to celebrate the event and just have a friendly dinner together. The three good friends took their dinner plans to the Redwood Restaurant, which was located south of Lancaster, Kentucky, on US 27, 35 miles from their hometown of Liberty. As the three finished their dinner, they started what they thought would be a nice, pleasant drive back to their houses. Little did they know what would lay in store for them and what would be a night they could never forget. Upon leaving the restaurant, the woman came across what they described as a bright red object in the sky. Mona Stafford thought it was an airplane on fire, but as it approached, they saw it wasn't that. According to their tale, the object stopped a few hundred yards in front of them, an object bigger than two houses, which rocked back and forth a few times and moved off. Perhaps at this point, the women felt their unusual sighting was over, but it seems the strangeness had only just begun. All three women would later recall the same thing. What they were looking at was an enormous metallic disc-shaped object with a dome on top and a ring of red lights around its midsection. The women all saw it close enough to see a yellow blinking light. However, after they had driven about a quarter of a mile, a blue light appeared through the rear window of the car. At first they thought it was a highway patrol car with its lights flashing, but soon they realized that the flying object had circled around and had come up behind them. Suddenly, something wrested control of the car away from Louise Smith. The car accelerated even though Mrs. Smith took her foot off the accelerator, and the speedometer was soon on 85 miles per hour. Mona Stafford, in the front passenger seat, tried to help Louise regain control of the car, but it was not possible. The women began to feel a burning sensation in their eyes. The ignition lights lit up on the instrument panel, an indication that the car's engine was stalled, but they were still speeding along. They saw a wide, brightly lit road ahead of them, and then seconds later, the scene became Highway 78, and they recognized their surroundings. They were on the outskirts of Hustonville, a full 8 miles from where they had just been. Checking the time, they found that, incredibly, an hour and 20 minutes had passed. Upon arriving at Louise Smith's trailer, the women found they all had red, burn-like marks on the back of their necks. Their eyes were also irritated, and Louise Smith reported the hands on her watch were moving at a much higher rate than normal. Enter the Mutual UFO Network. Picking up the story, UFO Casebook go into some detail regarding the psychological issues the women were having post-sighting. Mrs. Smith was having difficulties in performing her everyday duties as an assistant for the Casey County Extension Office. Mrs. Stafford was not only suffering from an eye inflammation, she was desperate to know what happened during the missing time. The three women were assured that they would be able to undergo regressive hypnosis and uncover their missing time, therefore alleviating some, if not all, of their emotional stress. Several things were evident to the investigators at this first meeting. The three women witnesses were sincere about what they had experienced. They were suffering from the so-called beam, and there were obvious physical scars from the encounter. Smith lifted her hair up and showed a mark on the nape of her neck. It was a roundish, pinkish-gray blotch the size of a $50. Dr. J. Allen Hynek and Walter Andrus from MUFON, MUFON, heard of the case, found the story compelling, and went to interview the women as well as give them regressive hypnosis. I am personally dubious regarding the efficacy of this hypnosis, but the tale, which Mrs. Stafford, the only woman to initially agree to be hypnotized, tells, is both strange and interesting. In a slow, cautious manner, Stafford began to recall the events of her night of terror. She was able to relive her perceived experience of seeing what she thought was an airplane crashing. She was not able to go into any further detail at this first session, as tears rolled down her cheeks and exhaustion set in. After the session, hypnotist Dr. Leo Sprinkle, why is that such a crazy name, stated that Stafford was still in a post-hypnotic state and that she should be questioned very carefully and cautiously. After the first and hypnosis, the investigators continued to ask questions of Louise and Elaine. Mona moved away from the others to rest. Another interviewer began to show Stafford some drawings of aliens. The word alien had not been mentioned in the case before this time, out of respect to the three, and also not to coach or lead them in any way. Mona sat and silently looked at the pictures, and then, in a dramatic fashion, she proclaimed, "This looks like the light I saw. It was shaped like that head," pointing to a specific alien. Again, Mona sat for a time thinking about that night. Then she added to her previous statement, quote, "Yes, I can see the face now, but it doesn't seem solid. It comes and goes. I mean, fades and reappears like in a fog. Its eyes are far apart, and at the bottom, the chin is like that drawing," end quote. The fact that Dr. Leo Sprinkle from the University of Wyoming became involved as the hypnotist working with Dr. Hynek is enough to convince me of the validity of this encounter. In so many cases, those that vanished were never heard from again or seen in any shape, manner, or form. It's an easy opinion to form that those that came back to us with little or no memory or a discombobulated understanding of what took place could just as easily have been whisked away by a UFO and its terrorizing crew. But what of those who were silenced forever, regardless of if they had ultimately been taken elsewhere, still alive, or cannibalized in some nonfiction horror movie like those of rock maniac filmmaker Rob Zombie? Part 2, Missing 411. The Retired Cop Who Put the Oomph into Missing, by Timothy Green Beckley. Before retired police officer David Paulides came upon the scene with his series of Missing 411 volumes, it could be said that there was hardly any life in the cases of people who had gone missing throughout the country. Outside of TV's Nancy Grace, such cases of those who had ventured off or were openly abducted and were never seen again received little or no attention. Sure, there were the milk carton kids, their photos plastered on the side of milk cartons. While those incidences were horrific, they still had a logical explanation. Some predator had ventured out of the woodwork to create havoc and went off with their prey of a young boy or girl to molest and kill before discarding the body. And while David has sympathy for the families of those so taken, his main concern is those unfortunates who took a few steps into the beyond and went missing in some space netherworld. Most of the disappearances David deals with have taken place in national parks in the U.S. and Canada. David, who was with the Fremont and San Jose police departments for 16 years and upon retiring became a respected private detective, Bigfoot hunter, and author, has become a frequent and exceedingly popular guest on a variety of podcasts and talk shows, for example, Coast to Coast AM, where he has been interviewed multiple times by hosts George Noory and George Knapp regarding his multiple book series, Missing 411. Is inarguably the first comprehensive research about people who have disappeared in the wilds of North America. It's understood that people routinely get lost and some want to disappear, but David's investigation is about the unusual. Nobody has ever studied the archives for similarities, traits, and geographical clusters of missing people until now. A tip from a national park ranger led to this decades-long a 9,000-hour investigative effort into understanding the stories behind people who have vanished. The books chronicle children, adults, and the elderly who disappeared, sometimes in the presence of friends and relatives. As search and rescue personnel exhaust leads and places to search, relatives start to believe kidnappings and abductions have occurred. The belief by the relatives is not an isolated occurrence. It replicates itself time and time after time, case after case across North America. The research depicts 28 clusters of missing people across the continent, something that has never been exposed and was a shocking find to researchers. Topography does play a part into the age of the victims, and certain clusters have a specific age and sex consistency that is baffling. This is not a phenomenon that has been occurring in just the last few decades. Clusters of missing people have been identified as far back as the 1800s. The research has become so extensive that it has now been split between a half dozen books, which David sells exclusively on his website, and it's called www.canmmissing.com, bypassing even Amazon. Some of the issues that are discussed in each edition: the National Park Service attitude toward missing people, how specific factors in certain cases replicate themselves in different clusters, exposing cases involving missing children that aren't on any national database, unusual behavior by bloodhounds and canines involved in the search process, how storms, berries, swamps, briar patches, boulder fields, and victim disabilities play a role in the disappearance, and the strategies of search and rescue personnel need to change under specific circumstances. David keeps up on all of the recent cases of mysterious disappearances, and his involvement, if any, can be found on his very active website. One such recent case involves lost Toronto firefighter who had search and rescue teams combing Whiteface Mountain for a week and who eventually found himself clear across the country. After a brief stop in the Adirondacks for police questioning, Constantino's Danny Philippidis returned to Canada, according to Frank Ramagnano, the president of the Toronto Professional Firefighters Association. According to reporter Griffin Kelly, writing in the Adirondack Ledger, Ramagnano said he spoke to Philippidis briefly but didn't ask too many questions because he didn't want to overstress him. Philippidis went missing at Whiteface Mountain Ski Center in Wilmington on Wednesday, February 7. Organizations such as State Police, the Department of Environmental Conservation, and the Olympic Regional Development Authority that runs the mountain set up a search and rescue initiative. They utilized helicopters, dogs, drones, and dozens of volunteers. The only problem was that Philippidis wasn't on Whiteface. He wasn't even in New York. Philippidis was eventually found on the other side of the country in Sacramento, California, when he called his wife from there Tuesday morning. Philippidis was eventually, Sergeant Sean Hampton of the Sacramento Sheriff's Office said, Philippidis called police at 9:30 a.m. after his wife told him to. Police found him by the car rental terminal at Sacramento International Airport wearing a winter jacket, snow pants, and a pair of Sorel boots. Hampton said Philippidis still had his skiing helmet, too. Philippidis told people he was a passenger on a big rig truck, but couldn't remember much about the trip or the driver because he possibly suffered a head injury, according to Hampton. Philippidis also told police he got a haircut from an African-American male while in California. Calls to numerous barbershops near the Sacramento airport did not turn up the person who cut Philippidis' hair. Despite his apparent memory loss, police deduced that Philippidis arrived in Sacramento Monday and stayed outside overnight on the sidewalks before calling his wife the next morning, Hampton said. She told him to call 911, which he did. Sacramento police are not entirely sure how Philippides got to California, but they don't believe drugs were involved. I can't confirm how he got to California, Ramagnano said. I don't know if he even knows how he got there. State Police Public Information Officer Jennifer Fleshman said she could not provide any information from Philippides' interview with state police since the case is still under investigation. David Paulides prides himself on a thorough investigation, leaving no stone unturned. In particular, he has concentrated on visitors to national parks who disappeared a few scant feet from the trail, often with their family members a few footsteps behind. Crater Place in Oregon seems to be the center of a great deal of David's focus. A feature article under High Strangeness in www.sott.net lays out a small portion of what DP has found himself confronted with within the confines of Crater Lake, said to be one of the most beautiful places to be found anywhere in the world. 10 years ago, 8-year-old Samuel Belkay darted away from his father near Cleetwood Cove at Crater Lake. He had a mild form of autism and feared loud noises and bright lights, so search crews couldn't use the customary air horns and whistles to find him. At the time, searchers told KOIN 6 News the family said Sammy liked to curl up in small spaces. The circumstances behind his disappearance and the subsequent inability of the Park Service to find him is unusual, Paulides said. They brought in canines. Canines couldn't pick up the scent. They brought in air support. They couldn't find him. A multi-day search couldn't locate the boy. 8 years before that, another 8-year-old boy, Derek Engebretson, vanished from a densely wooded mountainside above Upper Klamath Lake, not far from Crater Lake. Search and rescue crews spent more than 10,000 man-hours looking for Derek, but didn't find a single clue. When Derek was out there with his dad and his grandpa, somehow or another, he just walked around, didn't go far, Paulides said. There was snow on the ground. They should have been able to track him, and he vanishes. Scott Lucas, a search and rescue coordinator with the Oregon Office of Emergency Management, said only about 1 or 2% of the missions they launch don't get answers. They average about 900 searches a year. Oregon has its share of miraculous survival stories, too. Cody Sheehy was just 6 years old when he wandered off deep into the Wallowa wilderness. Search crews using 2 helicopters with forward-looking infrared technology couldn't find a trace of him in the rugged woods, dampened by snow and rain. In almost all these cases, they bring helicopters with FLIR, I guess that's forward-looking infrared, to look for heat signatures on the ground, Paulides said. They can't find a heat signature. That's unusual. Despite that, the next morning, 15 hours and 20 miles away, Cody walked up to a house and asked for help. I was physically at the end of my rope that next morning, she said, and if I hadn't been in a situation where people found me at the time, I don't know how I would have done for another night out there. I could easily have died. More than 30 years before Sheehy's harrowing experience, another astonishing story unfolded near Pendleton, where 2.5-year-old Keith Parkins ran and stumbled over a dozen miles of snow-covered timberland and mountains before he was found 19 hours later. He was stiff and cold but alive. I mean, to me as a parent, I can't see my 2-year-old climbing over 2 mountain ranges in the dark, Paulides said. That's pretty hard to believe, and there are some cases where little kids are alleged to have walked up to 20 miles a night or climbed phenomenal heights over 3,000 or 4,000 feet, and those are facts, and it's highly hard to believe. He says he's not an overly mystical person. I didn't encounter anything that was unusual, he said, other than the fact that that situation was extremely unusual. She is alive, but the fate of others, like Derek Engelbretson and Sammy Belke, are why Paulides keeps digging for answers. DP hesitates to speculate as to what is actually happening to these individuals that disappear while their loved ones are literally blinking a few feet away. Predators like Bigfoot or a wild man have been offered interdimensional portals a person can unknowingly step into without being alerted, and even abduction by aliens is not off the table. Best summing it up, one hardy outdoorsman who has spent many days and nights on the trail boldly confided, quote, "I find it very hard to believe there was an unknown force in the wilderness that is capable of taking people from right under the nose of others who were only a few feet away." But that does seem to be what we're talking about. So curl up with a good Missing 411 book available from the author's site. Watch the movie version, Missing 411, available on Amazon, and listen closely to what David has to say when he updates his findings on Coast to Coast AM. In the meantime, it's time to check in with our own reporters to see who has stepped into oblivion and won't be coming home for dinner. The true story of how saucer sightings have been linked to mysterious disappearances of hundreds, maybe thousands of men, women, and children, the whole horrifying story was told in the headlines. Oregon family of 4 missing in forest. Oregon Journal, September 5, 1974. Copper, Oregon. Their food was on the picnic table. A pan of dishwater had been set out, and dishes and utensils were neatly laid out near a camp stove. Clothes were folded on a cot. But Richard Cowden and his family, who were camping there, have been missing since September 1st. And finally, search called off. Oregon Journal, September 8, 1974. Here are the details. Richard Cowden, 28, his wife Belinda, 22, and their 2 children, David, 5, and infant daughter Melissa, had completely disappeared from the face of the earth, dressed only in bathing suits. The family was camped for the Labor Day weekend at the Rogue River National Forest Campground, 1 mile from the town of Copper, Oregon, which was near the California border. The last time any of them were seen was on Sunday morning at 9 a.m. when Richard Cowden went to the store in Copper with his son for a quart of milk. The family was expected at the home of Belinda Cowden's mother for dinner that night in Copper. They never showed up. On Monday, the Cowden's basset hound, Droopy, scratched on the door of the Copper store, indicating something was radically wrong. The owner of the store, Guy Watkins, and Ruth Grayson Smith, mother of the missing woman, called the authorities. "The camp sure was spooky," Trooper Lee Rickson commented upon investigation of the site. "Even the milk was on the table. It was as if the family planned to come back but couldn't. Everything in camp was in order. A stove and cooking utensils were placed on a stump being used as a table. Washed dishes were on the table nearby, along with bananas and other foodstuffs. Richard Cowden's wallet and his wife's purse were found, and both contained small amounts of money. Their fishing rods were leaning against a tree, and the family's Ford pickup was parked just above the campsite. There was no sign of a struggle or disturbance. Nothing seemed logical about the disappearance. Investigators were baffled. Quote, "We can't find any motive, any reason for them being lost," unquote, said Lieutenant Tom Phillips of the Oregon State Police. Nor was there anything to suggest foul play. The missing woman's mother believed they had never left the camp on their own, but might have been forcibly abducted. Had they been taken for ransom? Belinda Cowden's father didn't think so. "We are not wealthy," said Carl Grayson. The missing man wasn't affluent either. Richard Cowden drove a logging truck for the Steve Wilson Logging Company. No one ever responded to the $1,000 reward for information leading up to the whereabouts of the family. Oregon Governor Tom McCall authorized the use of the National Guard to aid state police and forestry personnel in the search. More than 100 specially trained search and rescue guardsmen of the 1st Battalion, 186th Infantry, combed the rugged Siskiyou Mountains. They were joined by members of the Alpine Rescue Club, friends of the family, and members of a motorcycle gang called the Hessians, who were in the region for the holiday. Even a psychic went along. However, not a single clue was found in the 25-mile radius covered, nor did high-resolution aerial photographs reveal a thing. The area is a wilderness of deep gullies and canyons with heavy forests. It's also crisscrossed with logging roads and honeycombed with old gold mine shafts. Most of the known shafts were searched, but the Cowdens knew the region well, having camped there many times before, so the chance of the whole family falling down an abandoned mine shaft was considered remote. The intensive ground and air search was officially called off 6 days after the family vanished. Although volunteers who carried on were coordinated by officers remaining at the site, the Cowden family had simply vanished into thin air. Only their basset hound Droopy knew what had really happened to them. State Police Sergeant Ernest Walden said there had been no indication that the family was kidnapped, but added, although we've all had the thought, kidnapped for what reason? And by whom? Checks by the Oregon police 3 months after the mysterious disappearance indicate their fate is still unknown. Ever since men took to the sea and into the air with wings, there have been disappearances. Whether wreckage is found or not, it is presumed some natural disaster or mechanical failure was the cause, and the oceans, mountains, or deserts have claimed the remains.
Should have given this to you earlier. Any important, any really good stuff?
It's okay to mark up the book? Yeah. That's okay, that's good. We're good. Let's see. Kidnapped for what reason and by whom? Checks with the Oregon police 3 months after the mysterious disappearance indicate their fate is still unknown. What about those frequent incidents when just the people themselves seem to vanish from planes and ships or right off the ground as if they were picked up from the face of the earth? So these are interesting stories, and they're all kind of, there's so many stories, one after the other. Like, it's unbelievable the amount of research this person did. And it's crazy that, like, a lot of them happened in national parks and places that were, like, wooded and remote and almost like tundra. It always seems to be cold places and things like that. And so it makes you kind of think, like, maybe I don't want to go camping somewhere remote. Maybe I always want to be around where people are. But, you know, the interesting thing is some of these stories had people disappearing when they were just feet away from their own family members. So I don't understand these stories at all. It's very interesting because you think, like, what is happening and what is the origin from all these different situations? So, especially, like, it seems that people are leaving behind their car keys, their purses, their wallets, their house keys. They seem to just have left. And you would think that you would bring those kinds of things with you, that you would want to bring your purse and your wallet and your keys and your house keys and car keys and all that. It's just strange that everyone they were just taken somehow, but they didn't bring anything with them that you'd think that you and I would bring. So I don't really understand it at all. But I do find it interesting, and I will definitely look up this 411, Missing 411 book series, because it seems like this person, David, I think his last name is Paulides, it's spelled Paulides, that he seems to have spent a lot of time looking into these stories, and I feel like he's got a lot of stories to tell. So the movie version, available on Amazon, of this Missing 411 book series, and then David Paulides, Paulides, is must have been a reporter who did a great deal of, I think there was at least 6 of these episodes. So David's website, so he exclusively sells these Missing 411 books on his website. And it's www.canam, like Canadian American, Canam, the word missing, MISSING.com. And so the whole site is www.canammissing.com. And some of the issues are different National Park Service stories, and that there's missing children and unusual behavior by some dogs and bloodhounds involved in searching, and that there's many search and rescue personnel stories, and that this person, David Paulides, really does a great job of collecting these stories. And he has actually looked at many stories that took place in national parks in the U.S. and Canada. So David actually was with the Fremont and San Jose police departments for 16 years, and upon retiring became a respected private detective. So that makes sense. He's actually a very good investigator, and I really love that he went on Coast to Coast AM, which I've never listened to myself, but I've heard has the most interesting stories and things that they share. And so apparently Missing 411 is inarguably the first comprehensive research about people who have disappeared in the wilds of North America. It's understood that people routinely get lost and some want to disappear, but David's investigation is about the unusual. It's a really nice way of putting it. Nobody has ever studied the archives for similarities, traits, and geographical clusters of missing people until now. So I would like to thank David for caring about all of these cases of mysterious disappearances. And I would love to check out his website and read some of these stories because he's been collecting them for a while. Some of the stories go back as far as the 1800s, and this is quite a bit of research. So I know there's a lot of shows and there's a lot of podcasts about missing people, but I think this is interesting because he's a retired police officer, and that he features the stories that have a bit of an unusual, mysterious kind of twist to them. So I will definitely check him out. I hope you do too, David Paulides. And thank you for listening. It's been fun reading from this book, UFO Hostilities and the Evil Alien Agenda, Lethal Encounters with Ultra-Terrestrials Exposed by Timothy Green Beckley and Sean Castile. Have a great evening. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.